Elephant Island Chronicles presents The Wineworm by Ryunosuke Akutagawa, translated from the Japanese by Glenn W. Shaw, narration by 11 Labs. It was the hottest it had been for years. On every hand, the roof tiles of the stone-floored houses reflected the sunlight dully like lead, and it seemed that, if this kept up, the little swallows and eggs in the nests under them must be steamed to death. In addition, in every field, the hemp and millet plants all hung their heads limply in the radiation from the soil, and there was not one, though they were still green, that did not droop. And the sky above the fields, probably because of the hot weather, seemed dull, although the sun was shining bright, and cloud masses floated here and there like bits of rice cake puffed up in an earthen pan. This story of the wineworm begins with 3 men out deliberately on a blistering, flailing floor under the burning sun. Strange to say, one of them not only was lying naked on his back on the ground, but, for some reason or other, had his hands and his feet bound up in a long cord. However, he seemed not to be greatly troubled about it. He was a short and sanguine man, fat as a pig, who somehow gave an impression of dullness. An unglazed jar of moderate size stood by his head, but it was impossible to say what was in it. The second was a man in a yellow robe, with little rings of bronze in his ears, who at a glance was recognizable as an eccentric Buddhist priest. From his exceptionally dark skin and his frizzled hair and beard, he seemed certainly to be from west of Tsungling. He had for some time been moving a whip of long white hairs with a red handle patiently back and forth, to drive away the horseflies and common houseflies that swarmed about the naked man. But now, seeming naturally to have grown a little tired, he had come to the unglazed jar and was squatting solemnly beside it like a turkey cock. The remaining man was standing under the eaves of a thatched house in a corner of the flailing floor, far from the other 2. He had on the tip of his chin a mere excuse for a beard like a rat's tail, and was dressed in a long black gown reaching to the ground, tied with an untidily knotted brown sash. Since he now and then fanned himself importantly with a fan of white feathers, he was, of course, a Confucian scholar or something of the kind. All 3 held their tongues as if by agreement. Moreover, they did not even move freely, and it seemed as if, deeply interested in something that was about to happen, they were all holding their breath. It seemed to be just noon. Not a dog's bark was to be heard, doubtless because the dogs were all taking their midday naps. The hemp and millet plants around the flailing floor stood still and motionless, with their green leaves shining in the sunlight. In all the sky beyond them, a sultry mist floated stiflingly hot, and it seemed that even the cloud masses were gasping for breath in this drought. As far as I could see, the only things that seemed to be alive were these 3 men, and they kept silent like the clay figures in the shrines of Kwanti. Of course, this is not a Japanese story. It is an account of what happened one summer's day on the flailing floor of a man named Liu at Changshan in China. 2. The man who lay naked under the blazing sun was the owner of the flailing floor, Liu Tai-cheng, one of the prominent rich men of Changshan. His only pleasure was drinking, and all day long he and his cup were practically inseparable. And since he drank up a jar of wine every time he helped himself, he was no ordinary drinker. But as has already been intimated, he owned 300 acres of rich suburban fields, of which 1/2 was planted to millet. There was no fear whatever of his drinking playing havoc with his fortune. And the reason he was lying naked in the hot sun was this. That day, as Liu leaned on a Dutch wife of bamboo in an airy room playing checkers with Master Sun, one of his fellow tipplers, The Confucian scholar with the white fan, a little girl servant, had come to him and said, "A priest who says he's from Paochang Sisu or some such temple has just come and says he must see you. What shall I do?" "What? Paochang Sisu?" said Liu, and he blinked his little eyes as if dazzled. Then raising his hot-looking fat body, he said, "Well then, show him in here." Then glancing at Master Sun, he added, "It's probably that priest." The priest of Paochang Sisu was a mountain priest from Sisu. He was famous in the neighborhood for his healing ability and the administering of aphrodisiacs. For instance, there were afloat many all but miraculous rumors of the sudden change for the better of this man's amaurosis, or of the immediate recovery of that man from sterility. Both Liu and Sun had heard these rumors. On what errand could this mountain priest have deliberately called at Liu's? Of course, Liu himself had not the least recollection of ever having sent for him. You should know that Liu was not at all such a man as to be pleased at the arrival of a caller. But if, when he had one guest, another came, he usually received him quite gladly. This was because he had a childish vanity that we may even say made him proud to have one visitor in the presence of another. Moreover, this mountain priest was highly spoken of everywhere at that time. He was by no means a visitor to be ashamed of. The motives that moved Liu to say he would see him lay for the greater part in such considerations. I wonder what he wants. Well, he's a beggar. He'll probably ask for alms. The visitor, who was shown in by the little girl servant, while the two were talking, was a grotesque Buddhist priest, tall and with eyes like amethysts. He was in a yellow robe, and his frizzly hair hung down over his shoulders troublesomely. With his red-handled fly whisk in his hand, he stood ungainly in the center of the room. He neither made any sign of greeting nor opened his mouth. Liu waited for a little, but meanwhile, somehow becoming uneasy, he asked, "Is there something you want with me?" Then the mountain priest said, "You're the man, aren't you? The one that's fond of wine?" "Ah," said Liu vaguely, the question being so sudden, and he looked at Master Sun as if asking help. That worthy was coolly placing men on the checkerboard all by himself. He showed no signs of taking any notice. "You're suffering from a strange disease. Do you know that?" said the mountain priest emphatically. At the word disease, Liu looked dubious and, stroking his Dutch wife of bamboo, said, "Disease, did you say?" "Yes." "No, not since my infancy," Liu began, when the bonze interrupted him. "You never get drunk when you drink, do you?" Staring at the priest's face, Liu closed his mouth. In truth, however much he drank, this man had never been drunk. "That proves it's a disease," said the mountain priest, and then, smiling a little, he added, "There's a wineworm in your belly. Unless you get rid of it, you'll never get well. I've come to cure you." "Can you?" asked Liu involuntarily, in an uncertain voice. Then he was ashamed of it himself. "That's just why I've come." Then Sun, who up till now had sat silently listening to the dialogue, put in a word. "Will you use some sort of medicine?" "No, there's no need to use medicine," answered the mountain priest curtly. Master Sun had always despised both Buddhism and Taoism almost beyond reason. So when he was with Taoist or Buddhist priests, he seldom talked. The reason he now suddenly spoke was that his interest was aroused by the name wineworm, for when he heard it, being fond of wine himself, he grew a little uneasy lest there might be such a worm in his own belly. But when he heard the mountain priest's grudging answer, he felt as if he had been made a fool of, and frowning, began to place the men silently on the board again, and at the same time He began to feel in his own mind that his host Liu was a fool ever to have seen such an arrogant priest. Of course, Liu paid no attention. Then will you use a needle? No, it's easier than that. Then is it magic? No, it's not magic either. After this little colloquy, the mountain priest briefly explained the treatment. According to his explanation, the only thing necessary was to strip naked and remain motionless in the sunshine. This seemed to Liu very easy. If he could be cured that easily, nothing could be better than to have himself cured. Moreover, though unconsciously, he had a little curiosity to see how it would feel to be cured by this mountain priest. So at last, making a little bow with his head, he said, "Then please just cure me once." Thus Liu came to be lying naked in the broiling sun on the flailing floor. And as the mountain priest said that he must not move, he was all wound round with a cord. Then one of Liu's servants was ordered to bring an unglazed jar with wine in it and put it near Liu's head. Of course, since he happened to be present, it was decided that Master Sun, his good drinking companion, should remain in attendance at this curious cure. No one except the mountain priest knew what a wineworm was, or what would happen when it was no longer in the stomach, or what the jar by Liu's head was for. Then you may think that Liu lying out in the burning heat naked without knowing what he was doing was a stupid fellow. But ordinary people receiving a school education are really doing very much the same sort of thing. 3. It was hot. Sweat came out on his forehead little by little, and no sooner would it form into beads than they would suddenly run warmly into his eyes. Unfortunately, being tied up with the cord, he of course could not wipe them away with his hands. Then he tried to change their course by moving his head, but the effort made him feel as if he was going to be violently dizzy, so he regretfully gave up this plan too. Meanwhile, the sweat, without the least ceremony, wet his eyelids, and going around his nose and mouth, ran down under his chin. It was extremely disagreeable. Until then, he had kept his eyes open, blinking at the scorching white sky and the field of hemp with its drooping leaves. But after the sweat began to run profusely, he was obliged to give up even that. Then Liu became aware for the first time that when sweat gets into the eyes, it smarts. So closing his eyes meekly with the expression of a sheep about to be slaughtered, he steadfastly let himself be burned by the sun. And now, all over his face and body, every inch of skin on the side that was up began little by little to pain. Over the whole surface of his skin, a force was at work trying to move in every direction. But the skin itself had not an iota of elasticity. So to say that he was one big smart probably best describes his pain. The sweat was nothing compared to this pain. Liu regretted a little that he had submitted himself to the mountain priest's treatment, but considered afterwards, this was still one of the less painful parts. While it was going on, he began to feel thirsty. He knew that Cao Mengte, or somebody, had once quenched his soldiers' thirst by telling them that there was a plum orchard ahead of them. But no matter how hard he thought of the sweet sourness of plums, he felt just as thirsty as ever. He tried moving his chin and biting his tongue, but his mouth remained as feverish as ever, and it would certainly have been somewhat easier for him to bear had the unglazed jar not been sitting by his head. But from the mouth of the jar, the sweet fragrance of the wine assaulted his nose incessantly. Moreover, perhaps because of his state of mind, he even felt the fragrance of the wine growing stronger and stronger every minute. Thinking that at least he would have a look at the jar, he raised his eyes. Rolling them up, he saw the mouth of the jar and the upper half of its generously bulging side. This was all he saw with his eyes, but at the same time there floated into his imagination the brimming golden wine in its shadowy interior. Unconsciously, he licked his chapped lips once around with his parched tongue, but there was not the least indication of any saliva. Even the sweat, dried up by the sun, now ceased to flow. Then followed in succession 2 or 3 severe attacks of dizziness. His head had ached incessantly for some time. In his heart, he gradually came to hate the mountain priest. He wondered why he, in his position, had ever allowed himself to be taken in by such a man's fair speeches and made to suffer such fool's pain. Meanwhile, his throat became drier and drier. His chest became strangely queasy. He could bear to lie still no longer. So at last he boldly determined to ask the priest to stop operations and, panting, opened his mouth. Then the thing happened. Liu began to feel an indescribable mass creeping up little by little from his breast into his throat. Sometimes it seemed to be wriggling like an earthworm, and sometimes to be crawling step by step like a gecko. Anyhow, some soft thing, in all its softness, was slowly making its way up along his gullet. At last, just as he felt that it had forced its way past his Adam's apple, something like a loach suddenly slipped out of the dark interior and sprang energetically into the outer world. At that instant, from the jar was heard a sound like something dropping with a flop into the wine. Then the mountain priest suddenly got up from where he had been calmly squatting and began to untie the cord wound round Liu's body. Now that the wine worm was out, they might feel easy. "Did it come out?" said Liu in a voice like a groan, and raising his dizzy head, and in the greatness of his curiosity forgetting even his thirst, he crawled naked as he was to the jar. When Master Sun saw this, he hurried to the others, protecting himself against the sun with his fan of white feathers. There, when the 3 peeped into the jar together, they saw something like a small salamander, flesh-coloured like cinnabar, swimming about in the wine. It was some 3 inches long. It had both mouth and eyes. As it swam, it seemed to be drinking the wine. When Liu saw this, he suddenly felt sick. 4. The effect of the mountain priest treatment was immediately evident. From that day, Liu Tai-cheng never drank another drop of wine. Now he hates even the smell of it. But, strange to say, his health has declined little by little ever since. This is the 3rd year since he vomited the wineworm, and there is left no shadow of his former plump, round form. His sallow, greasy skin is stretched over his bony face, and only a little grizzled hair remains above his temples, and it is said that he takes to his bed innumerable times during the year. But it is not only Liu's health that has declined ever since that time. His fortune also has declined rapidly, and his 300 acres of rich suburban fields have almost all passed into other hands. He himself has been compelled to take the spade in his own unaccustomed hands and lead a miserable day-to-day existence. Why has Liu's health declined ever since he vomited the wineworm? Why has his fortune declined? Such questions are likely to occur to anyone who considers his ruin in the light of cause and effect. In truth, these questions are considered and reconsidered by people in all sorts of occupations in Changshan, and are given all sorts of answers by them. The 3 answers I now give here are only those I have chosen as the most representative among them. First, the wineworm was Liu's blessing and not his affliction. Because he chanced to meet the idiotic mountain priest, he had deliberately lost this heaven-sent blessing. Second, the wineworm was Liu's affliction and not his blessing. For it is quite beyond the understanding of any ordinary man that Liu should be able to drink a jar of wine at a time. If, therefore, he had not got rid of the wineworm, he would certainly have died before long. Consequently, that he fell into poverty and illness one after the other should be called his good fortune. Third, the wineworm was neither Liu's affliction nor his good fortune. He had always been a heavy drinker. When wine was taken from his life, there was nothing left. So Liu was himself the wineworm, and the wineworm was Liu. Therefore, getting rid of the wineworm was quite the same as killing himself. In short, the day Liu stopped drinking wine, he was Liu without being Liu. If Liu himself was already dead, it was most natural that the health and fortune of the Liu of other days should have been lost. Which of these answers is most nearly right, I do not know. I have only set down such moral judgments at the end of this story in imitation of the didacticism of Chinese novelists. From all of us here at the Elephant Island Chronicles, we hope you have enjoyed this short story by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Until next time, stay curious